The shocking revelation. She gave herself to a creature not of this earth. The sentence lived in headlines for a week, and then in the odd, careful whispers of salon corners for a decade. It mapped itself onto Evelyn Marlo's life like a comma misplaced at the center of a sentence. Sudden, arresting, and somehow not entirely surprising to those who'd watched her for years. She had always had the look of someone who carried a private ledger folded under the sleeve of her gown. Polite, impeccable, the faint metallic gleam of good inheritance, but behind her polite sentences the page was often empty. On the night of the revelation, she was, as she always had been, dressed in pale silk that refused to make any noise. The rain that fell that evening felt less like weather than like an apology. Thin, persistent, as if the city itself were trying to scrub away some small stain. Evelyn waited beneath the portico of the restaurant where her circle had begun to gather, fingers closed around a glove that smelled faintly of jasmine. She had been the kind of hostess whose parties made news for the guests they convened and for the effortless way she wore absence like a jewel. People left her rooms feeling they had been seen, even if what they saw in her was only the outline of a practiced smile. The man arrived in a dark coat, his hair caught at a single point by the rain, his mouth smelling of a cigarette when he spoke. He was not handsome in the theatrical way men of their class tended to be, no classical jawline, no rehearsed charm, but he had a stillness that refused to be ignored, a kind of patience folded into the way his fingers toyed with the lighter. He watched Evelyn as if she were a book he intended to read slowly. His gaze catalogued her with pleasant, unhurried attention. There was nothing about him that had been announced in advance. He did not announce anything at all. They spoke first about weather, then about trivial things, an opera, the indifferent city, and then about nothing at all. His presence was a new instrument in the rooms she had accustomed herself to, an instrument that listened. Listening, Evelyn discovered, could fill a kind of domestic ache that money and attention had only ever masked. He asked about the jasmine in her conservatory, the porcelain bird on her mantel, the ledger of small favors she kept in a leather notebook. When you are used to being watched for the surface of your life, being watched for the inner scaffolding is a dangerous pleasure. At the door, under the rain, he took her gloved hand. The glove was thin and warm. His fingers were calloused in a way that implied a life not shaped by salon chairs and ledger balances. He smelled of metal, copper or iron, some mineral tang like a coin that had been in the earth, and rain. He let the cigarette die between his fingers and, without ceremony, kissed the side of her face. It was a quick thing, private in its bluntness. She had never been kissed that way before. Not in public, not by a man who seemed indifferent to her social value. She felt the puncture on her collarbone the next morning, a pair of tiny points, red and precise, like the imprint of a new pin. The marks were almost comical in their delicacy, twin dots that might have been the result of a careless earring or a clumsy seamstress. Evelyn showed them to her mirror in the quiet of her dressing room, turning for light and for the familiar anatomy of self-scrutiny. They glowed with a subdued, mother-of-pearl iridescence that the light could not flatten. On the dressing table, under the velvet of her jewelry box, there appeared a small shard, not more than a sliver, opalescent, the edges dulled as if by being worn against skin. It lay there as if it had been waiting for her fingers. She did not throw it away. She could not. Small things began to happen in her orbit. The first was Claudia Rhodes, a friend and a fixture at Evelyn's salons, vivacious, with the laugh that used to carry across the room. Claudia fell ill one morning after a luncheon, a quiet failing, the type of diminishment that does not shout. People spoke of flu and fatigue. She was gone in a week. They said she had gone as one goes in middle age when the small engines of the body stop, and her funeral was the kind of ritual that asks very little of anyone except to remember names and dates. Evelyn attended, pale and careful, in black, the twin dots on her collarbone hidden beneath a silk scarf. Someone at the wake touched her arm and made a passing quip about the weather. Evelyn laughed, because to do otherwise was to draw attention to a connection she had not yet formed into words. Henry, her chauffeur, a man who had been with the house for 11 years and who understood the rhythms of Evelyn's absence better than any friend, did not come to work one morning. He was found in his small room above the stables, no violence, no calling card, simply the cessation of breath. His hands were folded across his chest, as if in sleep. The hospital reported a sudden heart failure, a lacuna in the explanation that left the family stoic and the staff quietly upset. The twin dots were there, invisible under the collar of his shirt, two pale punctures that the doctor dismissed as insect bites, an oversight recorded and then forgotten in the file. Evelyn began to note things. Association is a dangerous skill when one has too much unsaid space inside. There was the stylist late one night, whose life trickled away in the corner of a cabaret, while Evelyn watched from the stage box. No dramatic scene. Only a small pause in the music, a breath, unreturned. The woman's hands, artist's hands, stilled, and the theatre filled with the kind of ache that is not meant to be resolved. The twin dots, when Evelyn dared to imagine them, sat like punctuation at the hinge of a sentence. It became impossible for her to dismiss coincidence. Memory arrived for her like weather. A lane one hot summer when she had been 19, the country house with its overgrown lane, and a boy with the wrong sort of courage. They had been young and trifling. They had laughed at a small thing and they had thought it was funny to set a trap. It was not a large cruelty in the account book of the world, an injured fox or dog perhaps, or a bird with a broken wing. And yet it had been theirs. A small creature cornered and then left to the judgment of the elements. They had cut a piece of it with a pocket knife, laughed and driven on, the sound of their tires slicing the night. Evelyn had told herself then that what mattered in the ledger of life was scale. Great sins paid for in great ways, small indiscretions ground down by the passage of years. Guilt, she had said, is the province of the romantic, but the memory of that animal's eyes, which had been too clear and too human for comfort, returned in the small hours with the taste of metal at the back of her tongue. She began, privately and without language, to count. She walked the rooms of her house at night and imagined names she had not yet had cause to remember aloud. She kept a small pencil in the pocket of her dressing gown and made marks on the inside of the leather notebook she always kept beside her bed. A series of ticks at first, then a crude map. The map circled the shard and the twin dots and the names that had stopped like candles in a wind. It was as if some account were being reconciled, but against what balance sheet neither she nor anyone else could name. Evelyn did what women of her world did when something untidy hovered in the margins of their lives. She sought counsel. Reverend Martin, an ordinary and kindly man whose parish was less a place of thunder than of small consolations, listened with the practical compassion that the good are allowed to offer without being required to solve metaphysical problems. He offered tea, an old paperback by the window, a calm that smelled of lemon polish. Evelyn tried to explain and found herself fumbling. She could not find the words that would encompass the way the rain had felt the night she'd met the man. Nor could she admit with anything like clarity that a shard had appeared on her dressing table, as if a thing had grown impatient with her silence and decided to make itself known. "You need not carry this alone," Reverend Martin said, though he seemed unsure whether he meant the grief that comes with funeral arrangements or the thing that felt like a riddle. He could not, would not, declare that the world ran by new rules. His role was not to ordain metaphysics, but to offer a light, small as a candle. Evelyn left with the Reverend's hand still warm in hers, and the feeling that she had been given only a place to set her worry down for a moment and not to be answered. Outside, the city continued to wear its indifferent wetness. Evelyn kept the shard in a velvet box beside the leather notebook, as you might keep a dangerous bird in a gilded cage, close enough to be observed, but near enough to be contained by habit. The object hummed to her in a way that might have been the mind's tendency to animate things when it is starved for explanation. She placed it against her skin and felt nothing at first, but then a tiny, dizzying sense of scale, as if a distant bell had been rung at the bottom of the ocean. It was a sound that did not announce itself loudly or theatrically. It simply altered the contour of her mornings. She found herself moving through rooms with a smaller appetite for company and a stronger appetite for the ledger of things. It took 3 small deaths in as many months for the pattern to draw itself into something that could be described. The world is not tidy about causation. It offered only the scattered chairs of coincidence and the tight thread of Evelyn's own memory. Her social acquaintances, the people who lived on the fringe of her life, and whose presence served to color evenings with brightness, began to thin. There were eulogies said in rooms where chandeliers trembled, polite condolences muttered in the half-light of conservatory glass. Each person who slipped away had a twin mark somewhere on the body that could have been written off as the consequence of some minor domestic injury. None of the deaths was loudly violent. They closed like doors rather than like shutters. The city's gossip, when it noticed, labeled Evelyn as one of those tragic figures to be looked at properly from a distance. Sympathy was given, but with an edge. "Poor thing," people said, and in the tone was the faint wonder of someone who has watched a favorite portrait fade, grateful it had once had color. But Evelyn felt the ledger in ways that gossip could not touch. She felt the quiet humiliation of being suspected of having some intimate connection to the deaths, and alongside that, the even more shattering humiliation of an authority within her, some small old ledger that sat behind the polished pages of her life, daring to say, "This is yours." There was a night when she met the man again, unplanned, in the half-light of her conservatory. The jasmine was in bloom, and the scent was magnified by the glass. He sat in a chair that had been out of favor for years, his coat folded into the cushions as if it had a history there. He did not look at her the way one looks at an object one wants to possess. He looked at her the way an accountant might look at a ledger. When she closed the door, the air felt altered, the way a room is altered when someone has been listening to it for a long time. "You cannot imagine how these things keep accounting," he said then, his voice soft as an arithmetic. He did not name the ledger. He did not announce himself as its agent. But his words made the ledger present as surely as if a clerk had opened a book. Things demand what they were promised. Evelyn, allergic to confession, found herself asking a question she had not wanted to ask. What were we owed? He folded his hands in his lap. They were the hands of someone who had learned the economy of small things, jointed, careful. "Not what you thought you could afford," he said. "No, not coins and not apologies, something older." The thrill of being listened to carried. She thought of the country lane and the small animal's eyes, and the way her laughter had once been an instrument rather than a responsibility. Her guilt, which had previously been a private, manageable commodity, began to feel like a currency in which the world actually traded. If debts could be called like that, there could be, perhaps, terms to their settlement. "Terms?" she asked. "Options," he corrected. "Certain houses have people who keep records. Certain families accept collection. You can refuse. You can substitute. Or there are rarer paths." Evelyn would, in the coming months, rehearse those words until they became a small, bitter nursery rhyme in her head. For now, in the conservatory, she only felt the walls of the room measured against her skin, and the shard cool in the palm of her hand. He reached for the shard as if it had been left on a table he regularly used. He did not take it. Instead, he suggested, with no sermon and no pleading, that she might seek a woman who kept an older kind of balance. a matriarch who lived beyond the city in a grove of gum trees that mottled the horizon like a memory. "You'll find her patient," the man said. "She deals in accounts men prefer to ignore." The grove was the kind of place that existed on maps only when you looked at them from a certain slow angle. It smelled of sap and something like incense burned by rain. The matriarch, known to some as Ledger Keeper, to others by no name at all, sat beneath an enormous gum, her hands folded around a small book bound in cracked leather. Her face had a geography of lines that did not belong to a creature consumed by vanity. Each line had the confident clarity of a bookplate. When she spoke, she did so in phrases that sounded like rules and like proverbs at once. "You have been keeping ledgers wrong," she told Evelyn the moment she had bowed and been allowed to sit close. The matriarch's eyes were the color of dried ink. "People keep ledgers as if debts were numbers. They are not. They are arrangements of attention, of being seen, of the refusal that is sometimes called choice. There are balances that require bodies to be realigned. There are accounts that want substitution. There are accounts that ask for self-offering." She did not say these words as if they were theatrical. The statement was plain, procedural. "What will it cost?" Evelyn asked, because the question had the bluntness of necessity. She had already paraded through her small remonstrances: money, time, explanations. She could not imagine a price that would buy back some of the things she'd watched slip away. "The cost is measured in what you are willing to forfeit," the matriarch said. "And understand this, costs do not erase history. They rearrange its weight. Some people wake, some people remain. There is no suitable arithmetic that will give you what you hoped for. There is only trade." "There is substitution," Evelyn ventured. The idea of offering something else in her place, an exchange that would leave her intact, was seductive in a way that made the skin of her palm prickle. "You could ask another to take what your ledger demands," the matriarch said. "They may do so willingly, but consent even freely given does not make the ledger less real. The ledger is impartial. It responds. It is not moved by pity." "And if I refuse?" Evelyn asked. "You may refuse," the matriarch said. "But refusal is also an answer. The ledger then proceeds in the way it knows. It does not punish. It balances." Evelyn had expected the matriarch to offer mercy like a commodity, an account manager with a sympathetic eye. Instead, the conversation smelled of a bureaucracy that had existed before sentiment and would continue after it. There was, in the matriarch's hands, a small book of pages filled with names and the notation of small trades. It was not a ledger in the way bankers keep ledgers. There were no sums, only the record of what had been asked and what had been given. On one page, Evelyn found a name she did not immediately recognize, and next to it the phrase, "partial reprieve," as if some previous hand had tried to translate the ledger into solace. "You chose to live with presence once," the matriarch offered, more a statement than a question. "Privilege buys you many things, but it cannot buy back what you set in motion. The cost is not to make you noble, it is to make you honest." "Honest how?" Evelyn asked, hearing her voice betray a small, dangerous hope that the ledger could be negotiated into a different grammar. "Honest about what you have done and about what you will do," the matriarch said. "This is not some grand absolution. It is bookkeeping. But bookkeeping has consequences for the living." The matriarch's explanation, despite its austerity, did not include coercion. She spoke of substitution and of self-offering as choices laid plainly on a table. She did not raise the ledger as a threat. She kept the book on her lap like a prop for small decisions. The matriarch's face was as patient as a clock. "People will say you are brave or foolish as they choose," she said. "They will speak in the idioms of their comfort. They will ask for stories. You must decide not for the applause, but for the arithmetic in you." Evelyn cried once in the grove, mostly because the idea of existing as an account terrified her more than anything else. Tears surprised her, hot, private, and immediately shameful. She had worn her composure as armor for so long that to feel was to admit a deficit. The matriarch made no motion to comfort. She simply slid a page across to Evelyn and pointed with a finger that was steadier than Evelyn's own pulse. "You have options," the page read, in a hand that resembled calligraphy and a clerk's economy both. Substitute, another offers their life to the debt. Self-offer, you bind your body to an instrument of balancing. Refuse, ledger proceeds with unassisted correction. Each will alter outcomes variably. Consider duration, restraint, and appetite. Appetite? Evelyn echoed. The matriarch smiled a small, wry smile. Even ledgers digest. They have an appetite. Some instruments require a steadier hand. Some instruments are like magnets. They will draw consequences you may not want. Evelyn's mind traveled as minds of conscience do to impossible acts. Who would substitute themselves gladly? Who would trade a life for another's old wrong? The social world offered charity in the conventional sense, donations, patronages, the exchange of favors, but not the kind of commerce the matriarch proposed. Evelyn thought of the house staff, of Henry, and felt the harshness of the question press against her ribs. Could she ask anyone to become the instrument of a ledger she had become entangled with? Could she offer herself instead? That night, alone in her bed, Evelyn opened the velvet box. The shard lay inside like something that had been preserved in salt. It did not shine with an obvious luminescence, but when she turned it in her fingers, the light caught it like the inside of an oyster shell. She placed it to her throat, and the twin marks throbbed, answering like a small bell. The shard did not speak, and it did not move. It simply sat against the skin and made the air around her feel thinner, heightened. She imagined substitution and refused it with an instinctive cruelty. She could not hand this to anyone else and then walk away, keeping her life intact as if she had not, in some small way, been the cause. There was a ledger inside her, older than her memory, that weighed her choices with the cool arithmetic of consequence. In that ledger, she read a simple line. Where injustice has been done, restitution will be asked for in a currency that will be felt, not counted. She dreamed that night of the country lane again, but in the dream the animal was not small and pathetic, but a presence made large by loss. Its eyes were wide and patient. When Evelyn reached toward it, the animal did not fear her. It only looked, and something in the look asked for an account to be balanced. Evelyn woke with the taste of iron on her tongue and the shard under her pillow like a promise. When she returned to the city the next morning, the world was unchanged. Some traffic, the scent of boiled coffee, a woman in the market calling about oranges. Her salons continued. People still wanted the pleasure of being in a room that had always been curated. Evelyn moved through those rooms like a woman who had sharpened her attention into the fine point of a needle. She began to make lists, small acts that might be considered restitution if the ledger were as literal as her fear suggested. She paid for a neighbor's errant mortgage 1 month, and then felt ashamed for the simplicity of the act. The ledger did not respond in gestures she could feel. It hummed quietly beneath the surface like a tectonic shift. A friend from the old days, someone with whom Evelyn had shared a houseboat in her 20s, wrote to her. "You look better," the letter said, as if there could be assessment without context. Evelyn stared at the ink and found herself wanting to confess, but unable to make the pen articulate the arithmetic she had learned. How do you write? Some things are not fixed by money. How do you explain that certain casual cruelties accrue like lint in the corners of an antique bed? It was in a moment of small domesticity that the world showed itself to be both crueler and more patient than any of her vocabulary allowed. She had been testing the shard's effect in private. Small touches on the inside of her forearm, nothing so dramatic as to mark her in the street. She recorded those touches in a ledger of her own, the date, the time, the sensation. On the third week she tried something more daring. A child of a friend, a small, pale boy who had once been broken by an accident and whose breath was a series of fragile agreements with the world, fell asleep on a chaise in her drawing room. His mother, a woman of brittle smiles, left for a moment to fetch chamomile. Evelyn, moved by a sudden compulsion she could call mercy, touched the shard to his temple. The boy slept deeper. When the mother returned, there was a roundness to the child's breathing, a steadier tide. People praised gifts like miraculous weather. The carpentered explanation was that perhaps it had been rest. The ledger, however, kept its own silent record. Some days later, the boy's father experienced a dizziness and, with quiet finality, did not rise from his chair. They found the twin dots on his neck, tiny and unassuming, and wrote in the file that it was a heart attack. Evelyn watched the open grave and felt, with a clarity that had nothing to do with sentiment, that her mercy had rearranged a tally board of quiet cruelty. She did not speak. She could not, at least not in the language of a society that prefers its miracles neat and unconnected. The matriarch's words flitted in her head. Substitutions are possible, but consent does not change the ledger. A kindness translated into a shift in the balance, and the ledger found a way to place its accounting elsewhere. That was its economy, to correct, without malice, the world until the scales achieved a new equilibrium. Evelyn's notebook became a different sort of instrument. She wrote names as if she were noting temperatures, as if each entry might alter the climate. She kept a running private tally, entries that read like this: May 3rd, Claudia R., funeral. 2 punctures noted, shard placed on collarbone earlier. Another, June 12th, Henry, no warning, shirt collar, twin dots. Another, August 2nd, child's rest, father's collapse, partial reprieve. These entries were not explanatory. They were catalogues, like the records of a clerk who has observed an anomaly in the system and is compelled to note it. They allowed her to feel that there was work to be done beyond her own terror. People began to whisper that Evelyn was changed. Her friends said she had a new severity, a different attention in the way she listened. She had less appetite for frivolity and more appetite for stopped things. She began to keep small domestic gestures, feeding the gardener's cat, leaving a packet of tea for the missus who dusted the pewter in her sitting room like liturgies. They were not grand. The ledger did not ask for spectacle. It asked for an arrangement. There were nights when she would look into the mirror and find the twin punctures luminous in a private way, as if they were not scars, but signs left by a tattooing instrument. They made her feel older and more inscrutable, and at times she covered them with scarves until the pattern of her life, scarf, necklace, polite smile, masked something that the world had begun to distance. The man continued to appear in her life at intervals. He began to occupy a chair in the edge of her rooms, like someone who belonged to the furniture, his coat folded into the cushions. He asked little and listened more, presenting his presence like a mirror, unflinching and cool. Evelyn, who had once used her salons to distract herself from the emptiness beneath, found that being observed by him felt like accounting, the kind that required honesty rather than performance. He never called himself the ledger's agent. He never denied that there might be other explanations for the string of losses. He offered no theatrics, only small observations. Huddled economies often beg for one instrument, he once said in the conservatory, the jasmine heavy in the night air. Someone to be the hand that balances. You could be that hand, she asked, more sharply than she had intended. His face gave nothing away. You could be, he said, but that is not the same as being the only possible hand. She asked the matriarch in the grove for details about what substituting might involve. The woman produced the ledger, flipped to a thin set of pages and pointed to lines that read like instructions. She did not promise resolution. She did not offer heroics. Instead, she talked of appetite, of instruments grown hungry, of partial reprieve, and of the patience of accounts. "You must understand this," the matriarch told her one evening as the light around them shrank to the color of old coins. "There is no final erasure. There is only arrangement. You may choose to be instrument. You may choose to find a substitute. But be prepared for what follows. Instruments need discipline. Substitutes? Well, substitutes sometimes demand more than you suppose." "Does the ledger forgive?" Evelyn whispered, because she wished for it to be possible that the world could be bowed into clemency. "Forgiveness is a different economy," the matriarch said. "The ledger balances. It does not absolve." Evelyn left with the ledger's phrase like a bruise. In the days that followed, she tested small acts, placing the shard above a palm to see if a dying plant might awaken, touching a limp bird's wing to see if strength would return. The effects were inconsistent. Some things stirred, others yielded nothing. The ledger was not a simple instrument of healing any more than it was retribution. It was an old machine whose gears turned according to rules that were not wholly knowable. A week after the meeting in the grove, Evelyn received a visit from one of the household's minor friends, a woman who had once been on the periphery of their group, and who now came bearing the kind of simple news that has the capacity to tip a life. The woman's voice was steady and precise as she informed Evelyn that her husband, an otherwise healthy man of modest habits, had fallen ill. There were twin dots on his neck. He was drifting. Evelyn felt with a clarity that pricked like ice the ledger's appetite at her breast. She thought of substitution, of asking the woman who sat before her to choose a trade, of the cost to a life that had not consented to become an instrument. She thought also of self-offering and the price its acceptance would levy. She had prayed, in the way of people made of social rituals, for impossible absolution that did not ask for payment. The matriarch's ledger had no discount for regret. The diner in which she found herself after the visit was empty save for an elderly man who read a newspaper and the wash of late-night servers. The shard trembled in the velvet box in her purse as if it were a living thing. She considered the options again and again, writing little numerals in the margins of her leather notebook like a person trying to teach themselves arithmetic at the edge of a precipice. At last, when the city's light softened to blue and the jasmine in her conservatory closed its petals for the night, she made a decision of a kind. She did not announce it. She locked the door and sat with the shard in her palm. She contemplated what it would mean to offer herself. To imagine her life reconfigured into an instrument was not to imagine sublime martyrdom. It was to picture a continuous small fatigue, a slow hunger that might become as much a part of her as the sound of her shoes on the stairs. It was to imagine being called upon again and again to balance a world she had once thought ornamental. She thought of Henry, of Claudia, of the child's father who had folded and not recovered. She thought of the animal in the lane and the way its eyes had claimed her attention in a way that years of refinement could not erase. The man had told her the ledger had requirements. The matriarch had shown her the book. Now she felt the ledger's page turned toward her, patient and impartial. She sat with the shard until dawn, the city outside growing pale and precise. The weight of the choice made her feel both trivial and central at once. Trivial because the ledger had no interest in her feelings, and central because she had the odd agency of offering herself. She had always been good at making things look effortless. Now she faced the honest animal labor of actually choosing. When she stepped into the grove again, the matriarch looked up and did not feign surprise. It was the ledger that called for surprise seldom. The matriarch's hands were patient as she took the shard into the light. She did not praise Evelyn for her courage, nor condemn her for her past. She only read the pages and made a few marks. "There will be effects you cannot foresee," she said, as if concluding a paragraph that had been long and dense. "You will gain an instrument. Instruments require tending. They will ask of you. You will be given small capacities to move balances. But you will also carry appetite. and appetite is the ledger's true test. Evelyn felt, at that sentence, the tightness of a hinge. The grove smelled like sap and rain, and the small sweetness of a world that does not want to be measured by one account book alone. The matriarch closed the ledger and slid it toward Evelyn, as if it were a legal document that required only the signature of a woman who had learned how to be careful with herself. "Choose," the matriarch said. "The ledger waits. It is patient, because patience is its currency." Evelyn felt the shard in her palm like a thing that might be warm or might not. The man was not in the grove. He would be there later, she supposed, a presence folded into the furniture of her life. She ran her thumb over the shard and felt the edges that had been dulled by use. In that moment, the world held its breath, and then she reached up to sign with a hand that had held many glasses and served many toasts, and set her name down in a ledger that no chart could fully render. She signed with the hand she had used for so many polite things, pouring tea, setting down invitations, adjusting a collar so the silhouette of a life would read precisely as intended. The matriarch closed the ledger like a book and did not blink. There was no flourish. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a clerk who has completed an inventory and knows the next steps by rote. They returned to Evelyn's house in a carriage made quieter by the night. The city outside their windows was a smear of lamps and rain, the way a memory softens at the edges. The shard sat on a square of white linen in the palm of Evelyn's hand, a thing that looked at once fragile and inevitable, like a promise written small enough to be kept in a pocket. The man walked at a measured distance behind the carriage, as if someone had left him partway through the frame of Evelyn's life, and yet expected him to take his place in the next scene. In the drawing room, the jasmine closed its pale petals against the late hour. Evelyn arranged pillows with the consideration of a woman who had always set things to make them look comfortable. She wanted the object that would alter her life to sit against the habitual, the domestic. The matriarch took a candle from a silver dish, let the flame lean, and watched the light pool. There was no music, no ceremony. The ritual had no stage, only a threshold marked by a decision and the small procedural acts that would make that decision corporeal. "You will feel rearrangement," the matriarch said quietly. "Do not expect fireworks. The ledger prefers the ordinary, for that is where most accounts are kept." Evelyn folded her hands over her lap, as if that simple gesture might steady what was to come. She thought of the animal on the country lane, the bright, unreasonable eye that had refused the easy cruelty of their youth. She thought of Henry's folded hands above the stable bed, of Claudia's laugh stilled, of the small boy whose chest had rounded for a time and then loosened for the father. She thought of the ledger's patient language. She measured the cost in the coins of memory and found she could not bear to trade them for the comfort of ignorance. The matriarch removed the shard from the linen and placed it on a handkerchief. It took light like mother of pearl, but not the polished prettiness of a jewel. It seemed to have been ground by weather, a thing worn into a softer insistence. The man sat in a chair that had been kept too long at the edge of the room and did not approach. He watched with a look that was not expectant so much as registered. Everything he saw was a data point, and perhaps in his way, a condolence. "You understand what you ask?" the matriarch asked. Her words were spare. They could have been a clerk's question or a mother's. There was a softness beneath them that was not sentiment, but respect for the weight of a person's choice. "I do," Evelyn said, and the certainty in her small voice surprised her by being steady. It was not that she believed she could right every wrong. It was rather that she would not let the ledger proceed without her hand on its scale. The matriarch set the shard against Evelyn's throat where the twin punctures had marked her days. The contact was cool and absurdly intimate, like the touch of a coin on the heart of a palm. Evelyn felt suddenly as if the house itself had leaned forward to listen. The shard hummed, a very soft sound within the bones rather than in the ear, like a distant bell struck beneath water. The hum spread in a slow tide through the channels of her chest and into the tips of her fingers. There was no voice that spoke from the shard. There were no words of bargain. There was only a geometry accomplished. Evelyn's attention folded into that small instrument, and, with a willingness that was both legal and devotional, she accepted the designation she had offered. The matriarch pressed her thumb to the paper of the ledger and left a faint ink mark as if to note an administrational detail in a ledger that did not want fanfare. The first thing she noticed, after the hum, was that her sense of proximity changed. She could stand in a room and feel where breath thinned. She could enter the corner of a house and sense which chair was worn by use and which by absence. It was not a power she loved the way one might love an acquired skill. It was more like being given an instrument whose strings needed tuning and whose use would be measured in small, almost judicial acts. Appetite, the matriarch had said. The thing came like a small tide, an attention that moved toward diminished things as a moth moves toward light. They did not test the shard that night. The matriarch wrapped it again and left instructions in a voice as casual as one would use to speak of a garden. Clean with rainwater twice a week. Do not let it touch iron for long periods. Keep it in linen that has been worn but not new. She spoke about restraints, about the ways instruments must be tended. At dawn she left without fanfare. The man lingered in the doorway, as if he were a housekeeper who had been asked to wait for the postman. The first true consequence arrived with morning light, and the ordinary language of newspapers and nurses. Claudia Rhodes, the vivacious woman who had been taken so quickly weeks before, awoke in a hospital bed with an unfinished sentence on her lips. Nurses called it a reversal of a misdiagnosed collapse. The obituary that had been scheduled for the following morning did not run. At Evelyn's door, a telegram arrived. Claudia was convalescing. The house filled for a week with the small, mechanical gratitude of family, visitors, warmed soup, a perfume that tried to make grief polite. Evelyn felt relief that was both merciful and suspect. The ledger had rebalanced in part, but the partialness of the correction was immediate. The matriarch's ledger had told the truth. Some people woke, some remained closed in the silent pattern that had first unclipped itself at Evelyn's collarbone. Henry did not rise. The child's father did not come back. The pattern of subtraction and restoration continued to look like the work of a patient clerk rather than the action of a deity. The public watched the returns and absences with the mixed curiosity of those who like their world to be orderly. Evelyn's salons quieted into an economy of fewer, more deliberate invitations. People came with their illnesses wrapped in the discretion of social conversation, a cough made into anecdote, sudden weakness folded into the charm of misfortune. They asked nothing aloud of the ledger, but each of them measured Evelyn the way a customer checks a merchant, with hope thinly dressed as inquiry. Evelyn found that she had, overnight, learned the language of restraint. The matriarch's instructions had been precise. Use the shard with intention, document every contact, mark the consequences. Instruments required discipline because appetite, unmeasured, could redraw the margins of lives without consent. She kept a new section at the back of her leather notebook, beneath entries that read like obituaries and household inventories. Her handwriting there was small and clinical, an echo of the ledger's own clerkly hand. May 17th. Shard bound at throat. Matriarch present. Partial reprieve enacted. Claudia R. awakened. Henry. No response. Note appetite. Mild. Increases near fragile things. She felt at first that she might administer mercy like a doctor giving a shot. She imagined a strict arithmetic, one life given, another life returned. But the ledger's economy was not linear. Sometimes she cured a fever, and some distant aunt in a small parish house took a turn for the worse. Sometimes nothing changed except for a small easing and a late-night notice that a seamstress had not woken. The ledger rearranged weight. It did not perform moral arithmetic in the way a conscience might wish. Word leaked, as such things will, though never in full form. A neighbor's maid had noticed the twin dots and spoke at the bakery. A reporter, more curious than patient, made inquiries, which Evelyn answered with absolute composure and vague hospitality. There was a rumor that a society woman had offered herself to a creature not of this earth. The phrase, once uttered, took flight. It threaded through teacups and gutter talk, with the sort of relish people reserve for stories about theatrical suicide or scandalous will changes. The sensation of being the subject of a story was familiar to Evelyn. What was new was being read as both author and instrument. Reverend Martin visited more often. He brought a thermos of tea and a small loaf of bread that had been made in a parish oven, as if nourishing the body might also feed what ailed the will. He said little about metaphysics. He offered consolation the way a man might offer a coat in weather. Practical, earnest, not designed to alter the underlying climate. "You are doing what you think is just," he said once, sitting with his hands clasped and the softness of a man accustomed to being a margin of aid. "I cannot tell you whether you have bound yourself to something good or dangerous, but I can tell you that you will not find peace by hiding. There is work, and there is the need for confession in the small way, language of grief, names said aloud. Measurement helps sometimes. It is how we keep a life from fracturing." Evelyn liked the way he spoke because he did not claim to translate the ledger. He was a human fellow of simple comforts. She told him about Claudia, about the child's father who had not returned, about the shard's dull song. He listened and said, in a voice that did not lecture, "Then perhaps you do what you must, with as much gentleness as you can muster." Gentleness became a practice. Evelyn learned to touch the shard like a nurse handling a fragile instrument. She bathed it in rainwater as instructed and laid linen upon linen in which it slept. She kept a little porcelain bird on the dressing table, its beak chipped where some small comedy had once occurred. The bird became a talisman. She polished it until it held the light like a small, obstinate memory. Over the next months, she moved through a pattern like a ritual she had rehearsed. Inventory, contact, notation, patience. She developed an etiquette for being used. People began to send for her with the same reticence with which they had once requested portraits, a telegram, an indirect plea, the typographic modesty of invitations that said, "Please consider." She declined many. Some begged. She sometimes offered substitution. She asked others to volunteer. A few did, with a noble inflection that she hated to see. Once a woman from a neighboring parish offered herself in a fit of grief. The matriarch examined the woman with a zenith of compassion and declared the exchange possible. The woman's family received a reprieve, and in return another man, a fisherman far from Evelyn's social map, fell asleep in his net and did not rise. The substitution felt cruel in its impartiality. It felt also true to the ledger's logic. Consent did not make the ledger an instrument of justice. It made it a complicated economy. There were times when Evelyn thought she had discovered a method. She touched the shard to a dying plant, and it turned green. She pressed it near the pillow of a fevered child, and the fever receded. She confessed to herself that the phrase miracle convened in people's mouths with greedy, quick tongues. When a teacher from a parish wrote to thank her for a student whose cough had calmed after a visit to Evelyn's parlor, a valorized human need sought to call that calm something holy. Evelyn refused the easy language. She wrote in the ledger, "Action taken with shard, child's cough eased." Subsequently, local baker's heart failure. The sentence sat like a comma between gratitude and cost. Her friends began to disperse, not always in anger, but often in a kind of quietly practical avoidance. Invitations grew simpler, or none at all. The salons continued, but where once music and gossip had been the ornaments of evenings, now there were more whispered calls for prayers and quiet visits from those who were too haunted to speak aloud. Evelyn's reputation bifurcated. To some she was saint-like, to others a figure of superstition. Businessmen and a few imaginative artists came to see the instrument. A craving formed in certain corners of the city for places where one might bargain with fate. Evelyn steadfastly refused to be a theatre for their bargaining. The man remained, a presence quieter than any lover, and more persistent than most friends. He would sit beside the conservatory window, sometimes looking at the jasmine and sometimes not looking at anything at all. He said nothing of his nature. Once in a while he would offer a small arithmetic remark, uninflected by pity. "It asks what it was told," he said to her one night. "Accounts continue unless amended." Evelyn found that the shard had altered more than her practices. It altered her interior life. There came a small hunger, an appetite the matriarch had warned about, that was not terrible so much as inexorable. It felt like a tendency to notice the slight failings of people. The hint of pallor beneath a neighbor's cheek, the way a seamstress's hands trembled, the uneven footfall of a man who did not raise his head. She learned to resist the pull of the appetite because giving to it indiscriminately produced outcomes that were ugly in their neatness. Restraint became a virtue she practiced in private. She counted the hours between acts like a penitent counting beads. When temptation came in the form of a story, an old acquaintance asking for her help in smoothing the death of a disgraced cousin, she refused with a steadiness that felt like a moral muscle. "No," she said. "I'm not a remedy for misdemeanors thinly disguised as tragedy." The man, furious and shameful, called her uncharitable. The city called her many names, all of which slid from her as rain runs from a waxed coat. Years moved like a hand turned slowly on a clock. The ledger, which had once felt like a single instrument set against her life, became a companion in a life that rearranged itself around purpose. Evelyn learned modest economies, small gatherings where those who were fragile might find shelter, a fund for emergency medicines that she administered with the same clerical care she gave her own notebooks, and a careful ritual for using the shard, always bathed, always wrapped, always documented. Reverend Martin presided over small blessings that were nothing like absolution and everything like a neighbor's kindness. The matriarch continued to appear at longer intervals, her visits like audits of a moral account. There were episodes that tested her. A wealthy patron, known for using his money as a curtain over other people's responsibilities, approached her with a proposal. He would fund her work and his private circle in exchange for a guarantee that he might avoid the ledger's correction. He wanted a substitution for his grandson, who had been reckless in a way Evelyn would not excuse. He tried to purchase her silence and her complicity. Evelyn refused. The patron, incredulous, threatened scandal. She sent back a plain letter. "The ledger is patient, your currency is not." Another time, a woman named Isabel, thin, gaunt with worry for a child dying of a lingering illness, came to Evelyn with hands clasped and a tremor that was not quite fear and not quite devotion. She asked for nothing but a chance. Evelyn considered substitution, asked Isabel to offer herself so that her child might live. Isabel's consent was immediate, incandescent. The matriarch examined the woman and recorded the exchange. Later, a distant uncle's breathing faltered, and he did not return. Isabel's child lived into adulthood with a life that did not know her mother's choice as debt, but as love. The ledger, in its impartiality, had reallocated the world's pain. The redistribution sat in Evelyn's chest like a small, unending hum. There were nights when Evelyn would stand in her conservatory and watch the man in the corner become something like domestic furniture. A coat draped over a chair, a presence that belonged to the room whether anyone noticed or not. In such moments she would feel the loneliness that binds people to their small rituals and wonder whether she had simply traded aesthetic emptiness for a more combustible solitude. Sometimes she suspected that the man was other than human. Sometimes she suspected he was merely a man who had decided to stand in the place of someone who keeps offices of balance. The ambiguity was a small mercy. It let her live in a world that could be read as many kinds of truth at once. In the quieter years, Evelyn kept the ledger physically near her, rows of entries that read like a clerk's prayer book. Her handwriting took on a specific neatness, the kind of economy a person develops when they must make sense of an unruly life. A reader who opened the notebook would find what looked like a record. Dates, minimal notes, the occasional parenthetical that read more like a confession than an account. Sometimes she would read aloud to herself the names as if they were rosary beads, giving voice to the people who had passed through her hands and the consequences that had followed. September 2nd, Mr. Lennox refused substitution. No change. Note, restraint successful. October 18th, Isabel offered. Child alive. Uncle. Past. Reflection. Consent complicated. Small acts of charity interleaved with those ledgered moments. She would visit the stables and feed the old mare who had been Henry's favorite. She would polish the piano in the drawing room and make insignificant music. These things grounded her in a way that the instrument could not. She discovered small pleasures without any ledger consequence: morning light on porcelain, the honest steam of tea, the gentle scratch of pencil on paper. Time did its usual erasures and insists, her hair silvered at the temples. The twin punctures remained faintly luminescent beneath the skin, a private mark that sometimes made her think of moths trapped in a china cupboard. The matriarch's visits grew more infrequent. When she came, she brought less instruction and more ledger notes in a hand that had begun to tremble slightly with age. The man's face changed in negligible ways. At times, Evelyn thought his hair had retreated a fraction, at other times that it had not. The measure of his temporality remained deliberately vague. Then there came an episode that fastened itself to her at last, and did not loosen. A small ward, a boarding house near the river where a community of seamstresses lived, caught a fever that spread not with the drama of a headline, but with the slow, hungry deliberation of a rumor. Several women were taken. The ledger's appetite reached out like a hand without malice. The matriarch wrote in the ledger and in her handwriting left a note. Collective imbalance. Consider instrument's capacity. Weigh public consequence. Evelyn went to the boarding house with the shard wrapped in linen and a small kit of medicines. The women who ran the house recognized her by name without curiosity, and offered tea like an acceptance of fate. She walked the rooms with a judgment that strained toward mercy, and attempted to touch as many of the ailing as she thought prudent. One by one, some improved. A seamstress with a cough that had once been a slow erosion of breath steadied and later returned to work. Others did not recover. 2 women, despite all care, closed their eyes in the presence of warm hands and kind words. When the steward of the boarding house, a widow with a face like a map of small sorrows, came to Evelyn with a plea to save her daughter, Evelyn felt the ledger like a scale embedded in her breast. She thought of substitution, of asking someone else to bear the consequence, and she thought of the matriarch's warning about appetite. She considered the network of consequences that would radiate outward. She thought of the men who might fall in place of a woman's life, of children who might never be born, of the quiet arc of cause and effect. That night in her bed, Evelyn wrote as she had not written in years, a small cipher of intentions, margins that read like promises to herself. She set rules: no more than 2 contacts per day, consent where substitution was requested with clear, sober witness, documentation within 24 hours. The shard belonged to a life of tendings, not to improvisation. "Make them rules you can keep," Reverend Martin said when she told him. "There will be temptation. others will ask. You must choose whether you will be a dispenser or a steward. Steward, she wrote on the next line, with the slow certainty of someone who had made a vow in another language. The boarding house's daughter recovered slowly. The ledger thinned for a time. The appetite retreated into its cyclic orbit. There were months of relative quiet. Evelyn found that quiet heavy with obligation rather than relief. She walked the conservatory more often than she had in her youth, talking softly to the jasmine as if conversation could be solace. The man sat on a wicker chair and, when she spoke aloud of her small triumphs, he acknowledged nothing more complicated than a nod. He never called her brave. He never called her foolish. He maintained the kind of neutrality that sustained a ledger's long attention. In time, the city's gossip grew more charitable. People who had once whispered horrors of sacrifice now wrote about Evelyn as a parable of contrition. A socialite who had given herself to the needs of others. The headline writers smoothed the edges of the story so neatly it became a moral anecdote for the Sunday pages. Evelyn found the attention less satisfying than she had imagined. She had not sought fame nor heroics. She had sought a language to arrange wrongs into a living balance. The years made their patient marks. Friends died of ordinary things. She attended funerals with the professional gentleness she had honed. She kept the ledger updated, each entry a small hammer tapping memory into shape. She had rehearsed, and now she rehearsed still. Not the adrenaline of rescue, but the soft competence of tending. The shard became like a domestic appliance, powerful, quiet, and useful if applied with trained hands. When she found the appetite bristling at the edges of her days, she would go upstairs, wash the shard in rainwater, and sit with Reverend Martin to speak of small consolations. He would not claim to make metaphysics easy, but he would brew tea and offer the soft geometry of human kindness. There were moments of temptation, always. A man who had once proposed marriage for the sake of a title, because social marriages had been crafted like fabrics, came to her with the pretense of friendship and the reality of asking for relief from an illness that had damaged his aged mother. He offered funds for her work and the promise of patronage. Evelyn turned him away with a phrase so economical it felt like a scalpel. "I cannot be hired for balance," she said. "That is not how this is kept." The man, affronted, told the story differently in his circles, that Evelyn had become proud, that the charity she performed was for her own vanity. The gossip took such fragments and sewed them into tales that would survive paradox and appetite alike. As decades softened into the kind of gray that makes one think of old photographs, Evelyn's steps became measured, not because the shard demanded it, but because years had worn the practice of caution into her bones. She had learned, over time, to refuse both the grand gesture and the small impulsive mercy. The ledger had taught her the humility of constraint. When new pleas arrived, single mothers, artists, a retired gardener whose breath had turned a dangerous pale, she approached them with the patient economy she had learned from the matriarch. The matriarch herself grew thinner and more bookish, as if the ledger had taken some of the flesh of her movement and left only the necessary bones. Her visits became slower, shorter, more like the readings of an aged instrument. She would sit with Evelyn and discuss small matters, the rate at which appetite should be allowed, the insidiousness of pride, the importance of tending to the smaller, harmless pleasures of life. There were no catechisms, only the slow, exacting language of people who know how to account. "You have been careful," the matriarch said once, laying her palm on Evelyn's hand. Her voice had the rasp of long experience. "Instruments like you wear in peculiar ways. You will be tempted to think the ledger is your enemy or your friend. It is neither. It is a ledger. Keep it honest." "And when I die?" Evelyn asked, because the thought of an end was unavoidable, and yet she wished to see whether the ledger would be merciful in imagination. The matriarch smiled without humor. Ledgers continue. Instruments cease sometimes. The account does not end with you. It has always been more patient than any of us. Make the entries you must. Leave the rest to the book. Evelyn believed she would die as many people do. Of age, in a bed with a curtain drawn, and a cleric reciting words of kindness. She had not planned a theatrically sacrificial end. She had planned small things. More visits to the boarding house, an endowment for the conservatory repairs, the polishing of the porcelain bird to a shine so constant that it might live on as a memory of her attention. She held to the notion that a life could be rearranged into a kind of public usefulness that did not demand self-obliteration. But the ledger is a patient mechanic, and sometimes its patience contains a single decisive moment. It came on a winter when the city contracted itself into cold. An outbreak of a respiratory sickness, quieter than the fever of the boarding house, and more diffuse in its reach, threaded through neighborhoods where families shared beds and breath. It was the kind of thing that did not make newspapers beyond a small paragraph and an earnest editorial about public health. People died in the unadorned way of a life slipping its thread. Gentler one day, absent the next. One afternoon a letter arrived from a district of the city to which Evelyn had no direct relation. A plea from a group of mothers who had lost many children and had reached into a network of charity to ask if anyone could help. The letter was a web of names and dates and a final line. They say of you that you have taken on what others could not. If ever a balance needed an instrument, it is here. Evelyn read it in the conservatory, the light falling like a thin confession across her hands. The matriarch's ledger note returned, in memory. Collective imbalance. Consider instrument's capacity. She considered the practicalities. Distance. The number of requests. The appetite that would surely flare. She thought of Reverend Martin and his simple offering of bread. She thought of all the small exchanges she had been part of. Her hand closed around the porcelain bird, its beak warm from the afternoon sun. She decided to go. The journey was arranged with a quiet economy that suited the ledger. She took the shard wrapped in linen, the man accompanying her as he had done in other travels, not as a lover but as a constant, an instrument attendant. They traveled by rail and then by carriage, the country thinning into a more modest life than Evelyn had ever frequented. The village was not dramatic. It had a church, a long row of houses, and a common where children sometimes played. The mothers who met her were not theatrical in their grief. They had the sort of humility that practical pain teaches, faces that had been made efficient by sorrow. Evelyn did not perform miracles. She counted and touched and otherwise practiced what the matriarch had taught her, restraint. She used the shard carefully. Small shifts occurred. A child who had been failing for weeks found appetite again. A woman's breathing eased, yet, in the ledger's indifferent economy, other lives thinned. A fisherman in a neighboring cove, someone she had not met, fell into a quiet sleep and did not rise. The ledger had no malice. It had only its way of balancing. One night, after a long day of doing what she could with the willingness she had chosen years before, a mother whose 2 children had been saved in the morning pressed her hands to Evelyn's and asked if she would stay. "We will watch you," she offered, as if care could be an exchange. "We will make room for you here." Evelyn felt an unfamiliar thing, temptation that did not proceed from appetite, but from a weariness of travel. The thought of staying in one place, of being an instrument in small tender hands instead of a tool for citywide correction, seemed suddenly luxurious, yet the ledger does not allow for simple domestication. Instruments are not homebodies by design. They are mobilized where accounts tip. She imagined a life in which she sat in a kitchen with a small stove and the sound of children running in the garden. Images that had once been frivolous to her. For a long, private breath, she allowed herself to think of being an instrument for a single small community rather than for the shifting scale of an entire city. The ledger waited, as it always did, with its cold impartiality. That night the sickness turned unexpectedly. The fever that had been subdued in one child spiked. The mother, who had already lost in other years, let out a sound that was less a cry than the rearrangement of a broken ledger. Evelyn, who had counted herself careful, felt the appetite inside her like an engine waking. She moved as she had been taught: touch, intention, withdrawal. She did what she could. When dawn found them, a child slept with breath easy, and a village had at its edges a small number of new absences. One man, unknown to Evelyn, a tailor who had mended the parish vestments, did not rise. His death was recorded in the steward's small book as sudden. No one accused the instrument because the ledger's work is rarely dramatic and never theatrical. But Evelyn carried the knowledge like a feather pressed to a wound. She slept that night in the humble spare room of a woman who had once been a midwife, and woke in the dark to find the man gone. He had left in the night, without explanation, like a guest who has finished a necessary duty. The matriarch's ledger had always suggested the man would appear where he was needed. Sometimes he did not stay to watch the consequences. Evelyn felt the loneliness of that departure as a finger at the base of her skull. She returned to the city thinking, as she had thought often, of the fine line between mercy and cost. She understood, with more clarity than she had once possessed, why the ledger might desire instruments. They were steadier hands than chance, and more attentive than public policy. They moved in a manner quieter than charity, economizing consequence in a way that left lives, some repaired, some diminished, in the wake. The years after the village carried the same quiet tenor, but with a new gravity. Evelyn's body, which had always been a well-appointed instrument of social life, began to show small signs of wear that were not entirely cosmetic. A morning stiffness that lasted longer. An appetite that, instead of ebbing between use, now hummed at a low baseline. The matriarch's visits became less about instruction and more about companionship in age, both women sharing the administrative silence of long stewardship. Evelyn kept making small rules, notes in the ledger about restraint that read like moral aphorisms. She forbade herself the use of the shard in political quarrels and in arrangements where bribery could mask effort. She would not let it be used to secure legacies or to spare a man the embarrassment of a scandal. She applied it to the small and stubborn needs: a young father whose lungs had rounded too thin, a seamstress whose fingers were numb and might never work again without the shard's help, a teacher in a cold schoolhouse whose voice had failed. Between acts, she read old entries in her ledger and for a brief time allowed herself the vanity of imagining that she had made a difference. Then some small, unintended consequence would reopen the margin and she would feel the ledger's patient indifference. The matriarch's phrases echoed like a clock. It rearranges, it does not absolve. That sentence became a kind of liturgy for Evelyn, a truth she repeated when the appetite felt like a hunger that might swallow her. The man's presence thinned over time. He would appear for a visit and then dissolve into absence. At times, Evelyn suspected he was not a single person but a function. Someone who appeared when accounts needed registering and walked away when the book asked no further. Once, in a late autumn, she found him at her tea table and asked him directly, with a boldness that had grown from years of intimate restraint, what he was. He only smiled gently, his face the color of old paper. "An accounts clerk," he said, and the answer carried the quality of a joke told in a foreign tongue. Funny to him, opaque to her. She had ceased, by then, to expect metaphysical clarity. The final years settled into a rhythm of tidy, necessary mercy. Evelyn's name in the papers became less salacious and more flattened into biography. People wrote essays about a life lived differently, and some printed her ledger, excerpts sanitized, next to photographs of her polishing the porcelain bird for some charity event. The public loved an image that did not complicate the obvious. Evelyn, who had once relished the superficial detail of being admired, felt none of the old pleasure in the press. The attention had never been the point. In a late spring, the matriarch did not come for several months. Evelyn felt the absence as a small, persistent hollow. She maintained the shard and kept the ledger, cleaned the linen, wrapped the object with the veneration of a shrine designed by a clerk. She woke one morning and found the matriarch's ledger lying on her doorstep, the pages uncut as if waiting for a reader. A single card lay on top, inked in the matriarch's hand. For when you need a witness. Evelyn took the book inside and sat at the table, reading until the light left the windows. The ledger was as patient as ever. Names, notes, little notations of appetite, and in the back a list of instruments who had bound themselves in previous centuries. The matriarch had written small, instructive remarks. Remember to leave small comforts uncatalogued, and a note that read, as if in aside, pray for appetite. The margins contained a thin geometry of advice. She decided to make a final set of arrangements. Her will, written in the precise, unsentimental hand she had adopted, left the conservatory in trust to the boarding house's children to be used as a communal flower garden. She provided funds to maintain the porcelain bird and bequeathed the leather notebook to Reverend Martin, with instructions to read the entries aloud to anyone who sought to understand the ledger. As for the shard, she left room in the will for the matriarch's discretion. An instrument should not be left to chance or to a bureaucracy that treats it like an artifact. Evelyn's last years were not dramatic. She aged in a way that avoided the melodramatic, the kind of diminishment that asks for spectacle. Her steps were slower. Her hands sometimes trembled. The appetite remained, a low purr that she learned to manage with the same discipline she had applied to everything else. The man's visits were fewer, but on the day before her last illness, he sat by the window, and in a voice that had always been arithmetic, said, "You have been thorough." "I did what I could," Evelyn answered. "You did more than many," he said. He did not praise, he merely recorded. Her final illness arrived like the rest of life's quietly inevitable things. A winter cold that did not abate, then a fever that thinned her breath. Reverend Martin came daily, bringing tea and the sound of simple prayers. The matriarch wrote from a distance and then came, her step a small creak and her hands more fragile. She did not try to speak the ledger into comfort. She sat and read, making slow notes in a hand that had softened with time. In the end, Evelyn's death was not a theatrical sacrificial moment, but the culmination of a life that had altered itself to fit a stern practice of mercy. She had given herself to be an instrument, had consented years before to a life that would be measured in small acts rather than headlines. And that consent accumulated into a final geometry of giving. When she died, her hand was in Reverend Martin's, and the matriarch's ledger lay closed on the bedside table. The city wrote things about her death that she would have found both quaint and insufficient. It spoke of a woman who had made a strange bargain, and who had, in the end, earned the sympathy of the public. The papers recycled the phrase that had first been the scandal's blade. She gave herself to a creature not of this earth, and padded it with eulogies that did not confuse horror with admiration. People came to leave flowers in the conservatory. Some left notes of thanks, others of accusation. A long obituary offered the public the comfort of a moral tidy. Her life reformed into a lesson. Reverend Martin, true to his simple rituals, read from a small volume and then, with civility, the city's crowd dispersed. The matriarch lingered in a corner of the conservatory and, when the visitors had gone, sat and turned that same ledger open as if it were a book she had read 1,000 times and still found new pages. She wrote one more note in Evelyn's copy, then placed the book back in the satchel she had always used. The house was left in the care of a steward, a distant relative who had a practical, if not tender, sense of duty. The porcelain bird remained on the mantel as if nothing had changed. The shard was placed in the little linen rectangle Evelyn had long prepared and left instructions for the matriarch to decide its fate. Weeks later, when the obituaries had smoothed into archives and the city's appetite for moral spectacle had moved on, a woman came to the house. She had known Evelyn by reputation rather than friendship. She had once been a maid who had found her way into a better life and carried with her habits of care. She answered an advertisement for a housekeeper and began to dust the conservatory and water the jasmine in the early morning. On a rainy afternoon, much like the night when Evelyn had first met the man, the steward who looked after affairs opened a drawer in the dressing room and found, beneath a stack of folded linen, a small box. Inside lay the shard wrapped in the familiar cloth. The steward, more practical than sanctified, brought it down to the woman who cleaned and asked for the matriarch's instruction. The woman's fingers hovered over the linen, like a reader about to open a letter. There was nothing theatrical in her movements, only a practical, polite curiosity. Her finger brushed the cloth, and she felt very faintly the hum the shard had always given on those rare occasions when it insisted on being noticed. It was like the buzz of a hive you hear only when you stand quite still. She touched the cloth. It trembled in her palm as any small present thing might tremble when held. The matriarch could not be there to witness this. The ledger was patient for such things. The woman who had once known what it meant to make a life out of folding and mending for others lifted the linen and, in the faint light of the conservatory, let her hand come to rest where Evelyn's twin punctures had been. Her skin was warm. The shard did not leap, and the hum did not swell. It was as if the instrument were waiting not for panic, but for calm. The woman's fingers touched the collarbone space, and then slid away, leaving no mark and making no proclamation. She wrapped the shard again and set it back into the box, then placed the box into the drawer where it would wait, as instruments do, for the ledger's call. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft as an apology. The jasmine closed its petals in the conservatory, and the porcelain bird looked on with its chipped beak. Lives continued in their average, persistent ways. Some mended, some ended, some rearranged. The ledger folded itself into the world's patient economy and waited. What would you have chosen if the ledger had offered you the same page? Would you have signed your name, like Evelyn, accepting the role of instrument and its hungry restraint? Or would you have refused, choosing instead to let balances fall where they might? The question does not arrive with easy virtue attached. It is a question whose answer will change the weights of many quiet lives. If this tale keeps your mind turning, share what you would have done, and carry the thought like a small coin you do not spend lightly.